Welcome to Shatter.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. I didn't hear it from her. I heard it from the way the table went quiet. We were standing on the patio, plastic cups sweating in our hands, that late summer noise humming around us. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else checked their phone. And then her friend Megan leaned in, smiling like she was doing me a favor, and said that my wife had mentioned I could be a little much. Too physical, too needy, too hands-on. She said it gently, like a therapist, like a warning label. No one looked at me after that. They didn't have to. The sentence stayed in the air, finished without being repeated. My wife didn't correct it. She didn't reach for me. She just sipped her drink and stared past my shoulder, as if the conversation had moved on naturally. I remember thinking how cleanly the word landed. Too physical, as if warmth was a flaw. As if wanting closeness was a defect you disclosed to friends over drinks. Earlier that day, we'd been at Kroger, arguing quietly in the cereal aisle about nothing important. I'd touched her lower back to guide the cart. She'd stiffened. Not dramatically, just enough to register. I told myself it was stress. Deadlines. Her job. The world. I always told myself there was a system behind things, a fix if I listened long enough. On the patio, I stopped talking. That was the first change. I didn't defend myself. I didn't joke it away. I didn't explain intent versus impact. I just went quiet and watched how easily my absence went unnoticed. Later, as people drifted toward the kitchen, I saw her texting. Her thumb moved fast, practiced. She smiled at the screen in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. Someone mentioned grabbing Chipotle on the way home, and she nodded without looking up, already elsewhere. That night, lying in bed beside her, I replayed the word again. Physical. As if touch had been downgraded to a bad habit. I thought about how quickly she'd exported that version of me to her group chat, how official it sounded once it left the room. I didn't argue. I didn't confront. I didn't ask who else knew. I did something quieter. I stopped reaching out. The first thing I noticed after that night was how easy it was for her to accept my silence. I didn't pull away dramatically. I didn't announce anything. I just stopped filling the spaces she'd grown used to me occupying. I stopped initiating small talk in the mornings. I stopped reaching for her in passing. When she spoke, I listened, nodded, and returned to my screen. From the outside, it probably looked like maturity, like I'd finally learned her boundaries. At work, I leaned harder into structure. My days were already mapped inside Asana. Every task broken down, timed, tracked. What changed was what didn't make the list anymore. There was no mental slot for us. No reminders to check in, to plan, to repair. I noticed how calming that felt. Systems don't shame you for wanting clarity. They just work or they don't. She, on the other hand, became busier in a different way. Her phone was always face down, always close. She said she was meeting friends, grabbing something quick. Chipotle became shorthand for those evenings. She'd mention it casually, like it was proof of productivity. In and out. No big deal. She stopped asking if I wanted anything. One afternoon, a name surfaced by accident. A former partner she'd mentioned years ago, back when we were still explaining our past to each other carefully. She referenced him the way people reference old songs, like nostalgia with no consequence. Creative. Free. Easy. No expectations. I didn't ask questions. I filed it away. What surprised me was how my body adjusted before my mind did. The urge to close the distance faded. The instinct to fix softened. I began treating her the way she described me to her friends. Distant, neutral, controlled. I watched how quickly she adapted to that version of me, how little resistance there was. One evening, she looked up from her phone and asked if something was wrong. Not worried. Curious. I told her everything was fine and went back to reading. The question didn't repeat itself. That was when I understood the real shift wasn't happening between us. It was happening inside me. I wasn't pulling away to punish her. I wasn't testing anything. I was observing what happened when I stopped compensating for her discomfort. What happened was silence. And silence, it turned out, traveled faster than any argument ever could. Evidence doesn't always arrive as a revelation. Sometimes it seeps in through routine. I noticed it first in the calendar. Blocks of time that used to be empty were suddenly occupied, but not shared. Meetings that weren't meetings. Creative sessions that didn't have deliverables. As a product manager, I'd spent years learning how to read gaps. What isn't defined is usually where things break, or where they're hidden. She'd leave with a lightness I didn't recognize anymore. No tension in her shoulders. No defensive explanations. Just a quick mention of grabbing food. A jacket pulled on without looking back. Chipotle again. Always fast. Always convenient. I stopped asking when she'd be back. At night, while she slept, I read. Not messages. Not screens. I wasn't interested in playing detective. I opened my Kindle and let other people's thoughts replace my own. It helped me notice patterns without emotion. Distance sharpens perception if you let it. The confirmations came indirectly. A credit card alert for a meal that wasn't near our place. A ride receipt she forgot to archive. A name that reappeared in conversation with more frequency than coincidence allows. It was the same former partner. The one without timelines. The one who existed before accountability became part of her vocabulary. What struck me wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the logic of it. With him, she didn't have to explain boundaries because there weren't any. She didn't have to justify closeness or distance. It was all assumed. Familiar. Unexamined. Safe in the way regressions often are. I didn't confront her. I didn't even feel the urge to. Once someone reframes your need for connection as a flaw and broadcasts it, they've already relocated themselves emotionally. I was just late to update my internal map. I adjusted my systems instead. In Asana, I archived a long-standing personal project. No ceremony. No notes. Just removed. I realized how often I treated our relationship like a backlog item, something that could be refined with enough iteration. That belief quietly expired. She noticed my calm before she noticed my absence. The way I stopped tracking her moods. The way I stopped syncing my schedule to hers. I became polite. Predictable. Non-invasive. Everything she said she wanted. What she didn't see was that I'd stopped including her in my future by default. The proof wasn't in her phone. It was in my silence. And by the time she sensed that shift, it was already too late to negotiate it. I didn't plan the disappearance as a dramatic exit. I treated it like a release cycle. The day I left, she wasn't home. She'd mentioned an afternoon meeting and an early dinner, something quick, something easy. I waited until her car was gone from the driveway, then moved through the house without hesitation. I packed only what was mine. Clothes, documents, a few books. No photos. No shared objects. Nothing that required a second thought. I turned off shared locations. Left the group chats quietly. Removed myself from calendars that weren't mine. My phone went to silent, not out of anger, but precision. Silence is cleaner when it's intentional. In the kitchen, I wrote a note. One sentence. No accusations. No explanations. Just a confirmation that I was stepping away and would be unreachable for a while. I placed it where she'd see it immediately, next to the coffee maker she used every morning. I didn't sign it. I drove off in my Lexus RX without looking back. The car felt insulated, sealed from noise. That mattered. I wasn't trying to escape emotion. I was reducing interference. Instead of heading anywhere familiar, I booked a short-term rental through Turo on the road. No return date. No shared itinerary. Just a direction. I let the navigation decide the rest. When you remove the need to be expected, movement becomes simple. She called that evening. Once. Then again. Then repeatedly. Notifications stacked without sound. I didn't block her. I didn't need to. Absence doesn't require enforcement. I watched her reaction from a distance I hadn't known I could create. Messages escalated from confusion to irritation to something closer to fear. Not panic. Disorientation. The kind that comes when a fixed point disappears without warning. I spent that night alone, reading on my Kindle in a quiet room that wasn't mine. No television. No scrolling. Just the steady rhythm of pages turning. I noticed how my breathing changed. How little space she occupied once I stopped feeding the connection. The next morning, mutual contacts started reaching out. Not to ask if I was okay, but to ask what was happening. I didn't respond. Let uncertainty do its work. By the time she understood, I wasn't coming back to negotiate. The narrative had already shifted. I hadn't vanished. I'd removed access. And for the first time, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was controlled. Distance creates room for leverage. Once I stopped reacting, information started arranging itself. Not because I was searching for it, but because patterns surface when you're no longer inside them. I didn't stalk. I didn't dig through devices. I paid attention to overlaps. Timelines. The quiet inconsistencies people forget to clean up when they think no one's watching. Her former partner was still operating the way he always had. Freelance, loose structure, emotional availability as a substitute for stability. What she called freedom, I recognized as exposure. When people don't anchor themselves to systems, they leave trails without realizing it. I didn't reach out to him. That would have been personal. Instead, I traced the edges of his work life the way I would a failing product. Public portfolios, invoices floating between platforms, promises made faster than they were kept. It didn't take long to see where the cracks were already forming. One afternoon, while reorganizing my own workload in Asana, I forwarded a neutral tip to someone who needed it more than I did. No commentary, no framing, just accurate information delivered quietly to the right channel. I didn't attach my name. I didn't need credit. Structures collapse on their own when pressure is applied in the right place. Around the same time, I noticed a shift in her behavior through mutual acquaintances. Less certainty, more defensiveness. Her quick dinners weren't feeling as light anymore. Chipotle stops stretched longer, the conversations afterward less energized. Familiarity has a shelf life when it's asked to carry weight it was never designed for. What mattered wasn't his decline. It was her realization that the alternative she'd escaped to didn't offer insulation. Without me absorbing friction, everything else started rubbing raw. She reached out again. Longer messages this time. Not apologetic. Evaluative. She wanted context, clarity, reassurance that she hadn't miscalculated. I didn't respond. Explanations are a form of intimacy. I wasn't offering that anymore. People assume withdrawal is passive. It isn't. It's strategic absence. When you remove yourself cleanly, you expose the load-bearing beams you used to support. By the end of that week, I could feel the balance shifting without ever entering the room. Her support network started asking quieter questions. His availability thinned. The stories she'd told about me no longer fit the situation unfolding around her. I stayed where I was, watching none of it directly. Silence doesn't push. It lets gravity do the work. The social shift didn't announce itself. It arrived in fragments. A delayed reply here. A canceled plan there. People didn't cut her off outright. They adjusted. Quietly. The way groups do when a narrative starts to feel unstable. When the version of events they were given no longer matches what they're observing. She tried to correct it by being more visible, posting more, showing up uninvited, laughing louder than necessary. The effort was transparent. When someone loses control of the frame, they often overexpose themselves trying to regain it. One evening, a mutual friend mentioned running into her at Kroger. She'd looked distracted, checking her phone between aisles, rereading messages that weren't changing. The friend said it casually, without judgment, but the detail stuck. Grocery stores are where people expect routine. When routine breaks there, it's noticeable. Her former partner stopped appearing in stories. Not intentionally hidden, just absent. The kind of absence that suggests inconvenience rather than mystery. Whatever ease she'd found there had thinned under expectation. Creative freedom doesn't hold up well when it's asked to provide stability or discretion. I didn't need updates, but they arrived anyway. Social systems correct themselves when one variable exits. Conversations recalibrate. Priorities shift. I wasn't there to absorb discomfort or smooth over contradictions anymore. The imbalance showed. She reached out again, this time through someone else. The message was framed as concern, confusion, a request for basic acknowledgement. I declined to engage. Silence isn't cruelty when it's consistent. It's clarity. What unsettled her most wasn't my disappearance. It was the way others stopped centering her version of it. The way questions changed tone. Less affirmation. More distance. Someone reportedly asked if she'd misread things. Another wondered aloud whether she'd pushed too hard. No accusations. Just reframing. She'd made intimacy a liability. She'd exported that claim socially. Now the social environment was testing it against reality. I stayed out of view. Evenings passed quietly. I read on my Kindle, letting time stretch without commentary. There was relief in not managing perception, in letting my absence speak without translation. By the end of that stretch, she wasn't being confronted. She was being left alone. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just incrementally removed from the center of attention she depended on. That kind of isolation doesn't bruise the ego immediately. It erodes it. And once erosion starts, It's difficult to reverse without something solid to stand on. She no longer had that. I did. Isolation doesn't feel like silence at first. It feels like static. She started reaching out more frequently, not to confront me, but to re-establish contact in the smallest ways. A forwarded article, a neutral update, a question that didn't require an answer but invited one. She was testing whether access still existed. I didn't respond. I didn't block her either. Removal works best when it's clean and observable. What changed was her tone. The certainty she'd once carried into every room had thinned. Mutual acquaintances described her as restless, unfocused, scanning conversations for cues she used to set herself. Without a stable counterweight, her confidence became performative. I stayed nearby, but out of reach. I moved back into my own routines without announcing them. Early mornings, long walks, evenings that ended quietly with my Kindle open, pages turning without interruption. I noticed how rarely I checked my phone now. How little external validation mattered once my internal frame stabilized. She tried to engage me indirectly, through shared history, referencing inside jokes, mentioning places we'd been. The implication was familiarity. The subtext was loss. I didn't take the bait. Memory is a powerful anchor, but only if both people are holding it. Her former partner didn't fill the gap. That became clear quickly. The easy intimacy she'd retreated to couldn't sustain the weight of her attention. Creative availability fades when expectation enters the room. What she'd mistaken for freedom turned brittle under pressure. She asked to meet. Not to argue. Not to explain. Just to talk. I declined without elaboration. The refusal wasn't emotional. It was structural. I had already exited the system that required ongoing negotiation. The hardest part for her wasn't my absence. It was my proximity without access. Knowing I was alive, functioning, unbothered. That I wasn't spiraling or waiting. That I hadn't replaced her or erased her, but simply moved past the need to be seen by her. People noticed. Not dramatically. Subtly. The way they always do. They remarked on my calm. On how settled I seemed. Someone said it looked like I'd made peace with something. They were right, but not in the way they assumed. I hadn't made peace with the situation. I'd made peace with myself. That's what she felt slipping away. Not me exactly, but the version of me she could influence, interpret, or manage. When she realized that version no longer existed, the isolation deepened. And for the first time, she didn't know how to talk her way out of it. Because there was no one left to listen. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine these things happen. There was no dramatic knock. No raised voices. No sudden confessions. It unfolded slowly, almost politely, which made it harder to deflect. She finally caught me between routines. Not ambushed, not cornered, just present in the same physical space for the first time in weeks. She looked different. Not broken. Worn down. Like someone who had been holding a pose for too long and was finally feeling the strain. She spoke carefully, not emotionally. She framed it as concern, as misunderstanding, as something that had gone off track but could still be recalibrated. She wanted clarity. She wanted to understand what had changed and when. She wanted to talk about boundaries, intentions, communication, the language of repair. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her version of events. I didn't supply my own. When she finished, she waited for me to fill the space she'd left open. I didn't. That silence landed harder than anything I could have said. She tried again, softer this time. Less polished. She referenced how distant I'd become, how sudden it felt, how confusing it was to lose access without explanation. She said she never meant to shame me, that the words had been taken out of context, that everyone talks to their friends. I nodded once. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. What I didn't offer was reassurance, or forgiveness, or my internal process. I didn't explain that the moment intimacy becomes a liability in public, it stops being safe in private. I didn't outline how thoroughly she'd redefined the terms without consulting me. I told her I'd heard what she said about me, that I'd believed her, and that I'd acted accordingly. Nothing more. She searched my face for reaction, for warmth, for the version of me that used to lean in when things got uncomfortable. That version didn't surface. It wasn't an act. It simply wasn't there anymore. The realization unsettled her. Not because I was angry, but because I wasn't engaged. Anger is still connection. This wasn't that. When she asked what I wanted, I told her I wanted consistency between how I was described and how I was treated. and that until that existed, distance was the only honest option. There was nothing to argue with in that. I left shortly after, went back to my evening, opened my Kindle, and read until the room felt quiet again. Behind me, I could sense the weight of what hadn't been said finally settling in. That was the moment she understood. Not that I was leaving, but that I already had. Her collapse didn't look like failure. It looked like exposure. Without a stable story to lean on, everything around her began to feel louder. Work became harder to frame. Friends became harder to read. The confidence she'd borrowed from group validation thinned once the group stopped reinforcing it. Nothing dramatic happened. No public fallout. Just a slow loss of footing. She tried to stay busy. Stayed online longer. Took on projects that sounded impressive but lacked direction. People noticed the strain in small ways. Missed deadlines. Over-explained decisions. Asked for feedback she used to dismiss. When someone bases their sense of self on external reflection, silence is disorienting. Her former partner didn't step in. Whatever comfort he'd provided wasn't designed to support consequences. He faded the way temporary solutions always do once permanence is required. She didn't talk about him anymore. Not because he was gone, but because the narrative around him no longer worked. I heard about her through others, filtered and incomplete. Someone mentioned seeing her alone at Kroger late one night, standing in an aisle without a cart, staring at her phone like she was waiting for instructions that never came. Another mentioned she'd stopped joining group dinners, stopped contributing to conversations she used to dominate. No one framed it as a crisis, just a change. What struck me was how often people referenced me without asking about me. They wondered aloud how I was doing, not with concern, with curiosity, as if my absence had shifted something they hadn't examined before, as if my refusal to participate had revealed a quiet imbalance. I didn't intervene. I didn't reach out to soften the landing. By the time someone collapses internally, they need clarity more than comfort. Comfort without accountability just delays understanding. I stayed where I was. Read at night. Work during the day. My life felt narrower, but sturdier. In Asana, my tasks were clean. No shared dependencies. No emotional labor hidden between lines. Just execution. She sent one last message. Not long. Not emotional. Just a question about whether I was open to talking again, someday. I didn't reply. Not because I was cruel. Because I was finished negotiating access to myself. Her world didn't fall apart because I left. It fell apart because I'd been holding it together quietly, without being acknowledged. When that support was removed, what remained had to face itself. And that reckoning had nothing to do with me anymore. The end didn't arrive as a decision. It arrived as a condition. By the time weeks passed without my involvement, the space between us stopped feeling temporary. It settled. Not heavy, just defined. I noticed how little effort it took to maintain it. No reminders. No restraint. Distance, once established honestly, sustains itself. I heard she'd finally stopped trying to explain the situation to people. Not because she'd found the right version, but because there wasn't one that held. When someone asks why a man left without a fight, there's no clean answer that protects everyone involved. Silence leaves fewer fingerprints. I didn't run into her again. Not in stores. Not through friends. Our paths simply diverged, the way they always do once shared routines dissolve. I stayed consistent. Morning work. Evening reading. Quiet nights where my Kindle stayed open longer than my phone ever had. There was no sense of victory in it. No relief spike. Just steadiness. The kind that comes when you stop trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. People assume withdrawal is a tactic to provoke regret. It isn't. Regret belongs to the person who has to live inside the story they told. I didn't need her to feel anything specific. I needed my life to align again. I thought once about what I would say if we ever spoke again. The answer surprised me by how short it was. Not an explanation. Not a defense. Just a boundary stated plainly. That when closeness is framed as a flaw, presence becomes optional. I never sent it. I didn't need to. What remained after everything fell away was clarity. About what I offer. About what I don't negotiate. About how easily respect erodes when it's discussed instead of practiced. I didn't disappear because I was hurt. I withdrew because staying would have required me to become someone smaller, quieter, less human than I was willing to be. There's a difference between being patient and being reduced. I learned at the moment I stopped reaching for someone who'd already decided that my warmth was inconvenient. So I stepped out of the frame entirely. Not loudly, not dramatically. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. And I never went back. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.